On a silent night, King David saw something he shouldn't have. A married woman taking a shower, and that moment of weakness started a series of betrayals, specifications, and tragedies that marked his life forever. But what did he do next is what makes this story so shocking. David was king of Israel, a man chosen by God since his youth. He started as one simple shepherd, but it was during this time that he showed courage by defeating lions and bears to protect their flock. David was just a young shepherd when he offered to face Goliath, the Philistine giant who terrorized Israel. Almost 3 meters high, impenetrable armor, and a spear that looked like a tree. Goliath defied any man from Israel to fight him, but no one dared to face him. When David arrived to take food to your brothers, heard the giant's taunts, and failed to remain silent, who is this uncircumcised? To challenge the armies of the living God, he declared with a courage that seemed insane for a young man so small. Before such a great opponent, David declined the armor offered by King Saul, saying, "The Lord who delivered me from the clutches of the lion and the bear, he will deliver me from the hands of this Philistine." He went into combat armed only with his sling, 5 smooth stones of the creek, and his faith in God, while Goliath laughed and belittled him. David ran towards you, turning the sling with deadly precision. He put a stone that hit the giant on the forehead, knocking him down with a deafening impact. Then David ran to Goliath, "Put your sword and cut off your head," ensuring a victory that would echo through history. That moment not only showed David's courage, but also proved that with God, even the smallest of men can beat the greatest of giants. And that is how he won the admiration of Israel, becoming a symbol of faith and strength. David was known for his wisdom as a leader, his skill as a warrior, and above all, your devotion to God. He composed many of these that today reflect your humble and sorry heart. But at that stage of your life, something had changed. He no longer went to battle as he used to. While his men fought, David remained in the palace. The leader who once put his life at risk by the people now looked too comfortable. On the Uriah the Hittite, a man who would mark the life of David and his entire family forever. He was in the middle of the war. He was not Israeli by birth, but he was one of David's most faithful soldiers. Uriah believed that fighting for the king was an honor. He was a man of principles who put loyalty above all else, while swords and shields flew around you. Uriah fought with the kind of courage that inspired others to follow your example. But while Uriah fought, David walked by the terrace of his palace. It was late, and he looked absent-mindedly at the city, until something caught your attention. Down in one of the people's houses, there was a woman. She was bathing, and David couldn't look away. Her beauty was unusual, something that made him feel an immediate attraction and almost uncontrollable. "Who is she?" he asked one of his servants. The answer was quick but loaded with a warning. "Es Bathsheba, daughter of Elian and wife of Uriah." Until David knew Uriah. He knew the Uriah was at that moment, fighting for Israel, and by extension, by him. The thought should have made him stop. After all, Uriah was a man of honor. But instead, something in David's heart made him hesitate. He kept looking at the house, as if he were waging an internal struggle. The king who had resisted so many external battles, now she looked like a princess from that inner battle. As David struggled with his thoughts, a question hovered, because he was there on the terrace. "While your men were at war, will the man chosen by God began to fail as a leader? What would David do next? Would forever change the fate of your home and your kingdom?" He knew he was about to cross a line. But attraction was like a force that reached him badly. Did he know that every choice would have consequences that he could never imagine? The night passed, but David's wish does not, and he tried to divert your attention, but the image of Bathsheba seemed to his mind. He knew it was wrong, knew she was married, and more than that her husband was one of her most loyal soldiers. David couldn't resist. With each passing day, the batting thought Seba grew like a shadow. He knew that calling her's decision was wrong, but justified it to himself. I am the king. Maybe it's not that serious. With that excuse in mind, David sent his messengers to bring her to the palace. When he beat Seba received the call, got confused what the king wanted with her, because suddenly the most powerful man in Israel was interested in an ordinary woman like her. But there was something she knew for sure. Nobody refused one invitation from the king. She went without question, as any subject was expected to do. David was pregnant. While waiting for the arrival of Seba Bat, he knew she would come, but what he didn't know was how to deal with what he felt. When finally she entered the palace, there was a strange glow in the air. They both knew something was out of place, but nobody said a word about it. She entered with respect, maybe even fear. He was king after all, and what he said was like an order. David received it with a look that she failed to interpret. It was admiration, guilt, desire, maybe a little bit of everything. He invited her to sit down, and for a few moments tried to act like it was just an ordinary visit. You are the wife of Uriah, is not, asked David, even already knowing the answer. For a moment, the name of Uriah hovered among them, as a barrier that David knew that you shouldn't cross. Uriah's the faithful warrior, who at that moment was on the fighting for Israel and its king. But David ignored that thought. He diverted the conversation to something lighter, trying to make Seba Beats comfortable. You are very respected. Your husband is a great man, he said as he watched her closely. She politely thanked, but it was clear it was uncomfortable. She didn't understand why she had been called there. And maybe, somewhere inside it, a suspicion began to emerge. David, however, was no ordinary man. He knew how to use the words. Your position as king, combined with your natural glow, made him almost irresistible. He started talking about simple things, but little by little the tone changed. He began to praise her beauty. You are an extraordinary woman, Seba Bat. It's easy to understand why Uriah is so devoted to you. She stayed in silence, maybe trying to decide what it meant, but David's intention soon became clear. He approached, and at that moment, Seba realized there was no way out. The king refuse an order, or even oxygen, was something that could have consequences. David knew she was vulnerable. He knew that at that moment, had the power to decide how it would end. But he didn't stop. He moved on, crossing a line that could never be erased. David approached, breaking the distance between him and Seba. Your eyes were fixed on her, and his words began to diminish, replaced by a heavy shower. Who said more than any speech could transmit. Bathsheba was vulnerable. She knew who stood before the most powerful man in Israel, someone who could decide her fate. With a single word, he was the king, but at that moment, he was not the fair leader his people knew. Was a man dominated by desire. When David first played it, Bathsheba did not protest, not because I wanted that, but because I knew I had no choice. Was the weight of absolute power he held firmly, but also with a care that seemed contradict the sin he was about to commit. For David, that moment was a mixture of desire and justification. He knew it was wrong, but allowed his heart to deceive him, as if it was something inevitable, something he couldn't control. In that room, what started with words, it turned into something deeper, more intense and more dangerous. It was a time when the limits were crossed, where desire overcomes reason and power overcomes morality. Was the kind of act you carry within you, a mark that never disappears. For Sebabat, it was impossible to forget the feeling of being led to something she didn't want, but that I couldn't refuse. For David, the weight of that moment would be hidden in your heart. Like a shadow he would try to ignore. When everything fell, there was an overwhelming glow. David watched Bathsheba get dressed, and for the first time seemed to realize what he had done. But he didn't say anything. He was the king, and at that moment, it seemed enough to justify anything. Bathsheba left the palace with a heavy heart, carrying with him the memory of that meeting. It was the beginning of something that couldn't be undone, something that wouldn't be buried for long. Days later, a message reached David. Just 3 words that made him realize that his secret, it wouldn't be hidden. I'm curious. Now he would need to face the consequences of your choices, but the price would be much bigger than he could imagine. Davi couldn't take his eyes off that message. It was just a matter of time until people started asking questions. The people your advisors Uriah. Just thinking about the name of the man who risked his life on the fighting blindly by a king who had betrayed his trust so brutally. David felt a lump in his stomach. But instead of regret, his mind began to concoct a plan. He needed to cover up the mistake, whatever it cost. He called his advisors and ordered the Uriah be brought back from the... Tell him I need a report about the progress of the war, said David. But the truth was much darker. He expected Uriah to go home, spent the night with Bathsheba, and so no one would ever question who the son was. When Uriah arrived, I was tired, but still proud to serve the king. He entered the throne room with the same dignity that led to the... My king, what do you want to know? Uriah asked, without imagining that the man sitting before him had just betrayed him in a way that he could never imagine. David asked questions about the war, feigned interest in details he already knew. But as Uriah answered, the weight of the situation only increased. David tried to disguise, tried not to look that honored man in the eye. But it was as if Uriah carried a light that went out. The darkness in the king's heart. You worked hard, Uriah. Why don't you come home tonight? Rest. Stay with your wife, suggested David, with a smile that looked almost convincing, almost. But Uriah refused. He wasn't the type of man that put pleasure above duty. How can I go home while my kids are on the... risking their lives? Not my king. I'll stay here at the palace. It was as if the knife David was holding was facing him. The integrity of Uriah was a silent affront. David's betrayal. Every word that came out of the mouth of Uriah seemed like a reminder that he was a better man than the king himself. David tried again the next day, offering wine and insisting that Uriah rest. But Uriah stood firm. When David realized he couldn't manipulate him, something inside him has changed. The man who one day wrote these of repentance and love of God. Now it was dipped in a darkness that seemed endless. If Uriah would not cover up sin of his own free will, David would do it another way. David sat at his table, the parchment in front of you, looked than it should. He held the sentence for a moment, unable to start. What he was about to do would torment him for life. Pen played paper, and words began to emerge, each darker than the previous one. His hand shook slightly as he wrote, but he forced himself to continue what he was writing. It was something no one could know, a secret that should be between him and that piece of parchment. When you arrive, David took the penalty sideways and looked at what he had written. Folded the parchment carefully. He called Uriah when the soldier entered. "With your loyal and respectful countenance." David faced him for a moment, almost hesitating, but there was no room for regret. He needed to stay in control. "Take this to Commander Joab," said David, delivering the letter. His voice was cold, without traces of emotion. Ulysses took the scroll without question. "As always, yes, my king. I will consider it my greatest responsibility," he said with a slight smile. For Uriah, it was more of a mission, a privilege granted by the king he so admired. He had no idea that message carried the beginning of something that would change your life forever. As Uriah left the hall with confident steps, David remained motionless. He looked at the closed door and for a moment wondered. It would be too late to go back. But he pushed that thought away. What was done, it was done. Uriah arrived with the king's letter in hand. He held her carefully, as if it were a sacred document, something of utmost importance to Israel's future. When he found Joab, proudly handed over to, "This is a message from the king. He entrusted it to me." His tone was firm, and his eyes shone with the honor of serving. Directly to David, Joab took the letter and looked at Uriah for a moment. Before opening he knew the character of Uriah, knew he was one of the most faithful soldiers in Israel, and it only made it harder. What was about to discover, as he breaks the seal and reads the king's words, Joab felt a chill run through your body. To each line, your countenance got more serious. When it reached the end, closed his eyes for a moment, processing what I had just read. "Thank you, Uriah," said in a firm voice. In the following days, Joab gave orders that seemed to confuse the other soldiers. He instructed Uriah to lead the next attack, putting you on the front line where the combat was more intense. That decision was unusual, but no one dared question the commander. Uriah, in turn, received the mission with the same determination as always. "If this is the will of the king and the commander, I'm ready," responded with a smile. For him, leading on the front lines was an honor, not a punishment. He did not idea of what was behind that decision. Uriah advanced to the front line, as he was commanded, but something was wrong. The captain of the other soldiers behind him seemed to grow, even in the midst of the chaos of battle. When he looked sideways, realized that no one else accompanied him. He was alone. Your heart shot. He screamed through his knees, calling the names of those who should lead. "Move forward, what they are doing. Don't stop." But his words disappeared in the noise, deafening of swords and arrows. The soldiers were retreating. He didn't understand. It didn't make sense. Terror began to grow inside Uriah. He looked forward and saw the enemies approaching, looking for quickly, because he murmured, "The blood running from your mouth." Your eyes returned to heaven, as if looking for answers that no one would give you. He didn't understand, couldn't understand. He had given everything, risky, all served with absolute loyalty. And now it was being left to die. David's face crossed his mind, and for a brief moment, the admiration he had always felt for the king was replaced by a devastating doubt. The enemies showed no mercy. They hit him again and again. As Uriah tried to crawl away, holding the floor with bloody hands, their screams were stifled by dust and chaos. When the final blow came, Uriah was alone, abandoned by those he trusted, and betrayed by whom he most admired. His last vision was from the empty field behind him. the same field where your companions. They should be fighting by your side while the soldiers collected the bodies. After the battle, the news of Uriah's death was sent back to Joab. He then took the letter that David had written. Now with fate fulfilled, he opened parchment again. He had received before Uriah, and read the king's words. The message was direct and cruel. Put Uriah on the front line where the battle is fiercest. Then back off so he can be left alone. Joab faced those words as if they had the power to burn you. He understood at that moment that Uriah had not been the victim of a war. He was the victim of a plan devised by the king himself. The man whom Uriah admired and faithfully served had signed his death sentence. The news reached David. Uriah is dead, announced the messengers. The king, who for days was consumed by anxiety, went deep. On the outside, he kept his composure, but inside felt a relief that was quickly hushed up by guilt that he didn't want to admit. He brought Bathsheba to the palace and took her as his wife. For the people, looked like a noble gesture, an act of kindness by a king who cared for the widow of a fallen hero. But inside David's heart, he knew your sin could not be hidden from God. David thought he had ended the problem, but God's justice was just beginning. Or Prophet Nathan was about to confront the king with a message that would reveal the true price of your choices, and that price would be higher than he ever imagined. Days go by. Since David received the news of Uriah's death, he appeared to be at peace, continuing with their responsibilities as king and now husband of Bathsheba. For the people, he was a conservative leader, someone who cared, even the widows of his soldiers. But inside David, something was different. At night, the weight of his actions bothered him. But he pushed thoughts away, trying to justify your choices, until the prophet Nathan was sent by God. Nathan arrived at the palace, and David received him with respect. He knew Nathan was a man of God, someone whose words always forget, laden with wisdom and purpose. The prophet began to tell a story, something David didn't expect. There were two men in a city, said Nathan. One was rich and had many sheep and oxen. The other was poor and had only one small sheep that he loved like a daughter. She ate from her desk, drank from his glass, and slept in his arms. But one day, the rich man received a visitor. Instead of taking one of your own sheep to prepare a meal, he took the poor man's sheep, the only one he had, and killed her to feed her guest. David listened carefully, and his expression began to change. He got up suddenly, full of indignation. This man deserves death. How can he do something so cruel? He must pay for it 4 times as much. Nathan faced for one moment before saying the words that David would never forget. You are that man. The air seemed to freeze in the hall. David was silent. I just responded. Nathan continued, now with a more severe tone. So says the Lord, I will anoint you king over Israel, and delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your Lord's house, and the women of your Lord, and if that were little, would have given you much more. But why did you despise the word of the Lord, doing what is evil in your eyes? You killed Uriah with the sword of the Ammonites, and took his wife as his. Every word of Nathan was like a blade through David's heart. He knew he couldn't deny it, knew that God had seen it all. From the moment he looked at Bathsheba for the first time until the sending of that letter that condemned Uriah to death, Nathan then announced God's judgment now. The sword will never leave your home. Evil will come from your own family, and the son who is born of this union will die. David, surrounded by, he did not try to justify his actions, looked for no culprits. He knew he was solely responsible. "Little one against the Lord," he said with an embargoed voice. It was a moment of true regret. But he knew God's forgiveness would not erase the consequences of their actions. Nathan's began to come true quickly. David's first son and Bathsheba fell seriously ill. And despite David's prayers and fasts, the baby died. The pain he felt was indescribable. But he accepted the trial as fair. He knew this was just the first of many consequences that would come. Over the years, David's house was marked by tragedies. Your children turned against each other. Aminom, your firstborn, committed a criminal act against his own sister. Tamale and Absalom, another of your children, conspired to take the throne, ended a civil war that shook Israel. Each of these tragedies, it was a reminder of the weight of David's sin. He was forgiven by God, but the similarities remained. David lived the rest of his life with the weight of his choices, but also with the certainty that God had forgiven him. He wrote many after these events, expressing your pain, repentance and gratitude for God's mercy. One of them became especially known: "Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew within me an unshakable spirit." As 51:10. This story isn't just about David's sin, but about reality, that even those chosen by God are flaws. It reminds us that divine forgiveness is possible, but that our actions have consequences that we cannot avoid. But that wasn't the only time that a betrayal changed the course of history in the Bible. In this on-screen video, you will learn the story of Samson and Delilah, a man with superhuman strength who has been defeated, but by the seduction of a woman he trusted. Wants to know why Delilah betrayed Samson, who loved him? Click on the video next to it and find out the details of this plot, full of deceit and tragedy. You won't want to lose.